Vietnam War has had a lasting impact on baby boomers and other generations alike. Today I'm here to talk about just how deadly and vivid the Vietnam War was for the United States and Vietnam. The Americans who fought in this war were young. The average age for a soldier in Vietnam was 21 years old. This was also the first war where a majority of soldiers were African Americans. This was because of the racial riots and protesting for civil and social rights. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy further added to the flames of outcry and opposition of discrimination in the war alike. An example of these protesters were the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or the VVAW. It started out as only 6 veterans protesting against the war in Vietnam, but shortly became something more. Membership in the group skyrocketed, and so did the scale of their protests and marches. One example of these protest march was named Operation Raw. Operation Raw was a 4-day march that symbolized the U.S.'s atrocities committed to the innocent Vietnamese people. The march included any and all Vietnam vets who wanted to join in, including the wounded and disabled. Marches and protests boomed even more during the turning point in the war that was labeled the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a surprise attack by the Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The northern Vietnamese attacked 100 southern Vietnamese towns and cities, 12 U.S. air bases, and even the U.S. Embassy. The offensive itself was a complete defeat for the Vietnamese and Viet Cong. However, this heavily damaged U.S. morale and the public's view on the war. This image of the Vietnam War was so terrible that Lyndon B. Johnson refused to run for another term. Johnson expressed his hate and regret in joining the war in one of his speeches, stating that war killed the lady I really loved, the Great Society. Nixon's choice for staying in the war turned out to be a terrible decision. He made amends though. He assigned Henry Kissinger to finally end the Vietnam War through diplomatic negotiations, or what Nixon called Vietnamization. This further added to Nixon's announcement of withdrawing troops, as Vietnamization made it to where the southern Vietnamese would take on a majority of the fighting since a ton of U.S. troops were pulling out. Who was asking for peace, Nixon wanted the northern Vietnamese to think he was capable of anything, so he secretly ordered a massive bombing run on major supply routes and bases in northern Vietnam. Nixon even announced that U.S. troops went to invade Cambodia to clear out and destroy supply centers. He defended his actions by proclaiming that if they didn't snuff out totalitarianism, they would spread to other free countries. In the events of Nixon's decisions, college campuses around the U.S. went berserk. Some 1.5 million students rioted and protested, and 1,200 campuses shut down. This became the first general student strike in U.S. history. The slew of bad decisions by Nixon was so terrible that Columbia University said it was the most disastrous month of May in the history of higher education. Shortly after Nixon won re-election, he became involved in the Watergate scandal. The scandal involved paper and tapes being stolen from the Democratic National Committee, which led to Nixon resigning. The president who shortly took up his term was Gerald Ford. Nixon is the only president in U.S. history to ever resign from office. 27, 1973, the U.S. signed a ceasefire and pulled out all troops and forces out of Vietnam. However, Vietnam was still at war with themselves, and despite all outcry, the U.S. refused to rejoin the war to help the southern Vietnam. This resulted in the northern Vietnamese rolling into the southern Vietnamese city of Saigon, where South Vietnam surrendered.